welcome everybody to this briefing by Dr. James Gomez, who's the Regional Director at Asia Center. The briefing on Myanmar and the prospective elections in Myanmar. I don't know whether all the king's horses or all the army's horses can pull Humpty Dumpty back together, but hope to learn from Dr. Gomez. So, without much ado, I'll ask Dr. Gomez to give his briefing, and then, of course, we'll open the floor for a Q&A. Rules of the game are very simple. Please identify yourself and put your question to Dr. Gomez. So the floor is yours, Dr. Gomez. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is James. I'm from Singapore. I'm stationed in Bangkok, leading the Asia Center for about 10 years now. Asia Center is best understood as a civil society research institute. We position ourselves as a civil society research institute as opposed to a foreign policy think tank, a geopolitical think tank, or a security think tank, because we want to give a perspective from civil society on some of the key issues. So our take is slightly different, and we hope to give these are the four offices of the Asia Center. As you can see, we are very, very well placed and strategic in Southeast Asia. We have two offices in Bangkok. One is a research hub where we undertake most of our research, and it's published out of Bangkok. We are currently setting up an AI hub for civil society in the region. We run a training hub in Cambodia, Phnom Penh, covering Vietnam and Laos. Our office in Bangkok does regional projects, but also covers Thailand, Philippines, and Myanmar. Last but not least, we have a media hub that looks after the media work of the center, but it's what we call our Nusantara office. Almost all the staff there speak Bahasa, and we cover Indonesia, Peninsular Malaysia, Borneo, Brunei, and also Singapore, which is traditionally part of the Malay language world. These are our core activities. I'm going to spend a few minutes to introduce the centers so you get a sense of what we do. We are here, the Asia Center is here this week to meet a suite of think tanks, including the ICWA, because increasingly we have been receiving invitations to many of the high-level activities organized by think tanks in India because they would like to tap our views on Southeast Asia. So that's why we are here this week and having this opportunity to speak to you at the ORF. We do about 50% of our work is on research. We do training. We organize a regular conference in Bangkok. We undertake media work. And because we also have UN ECOSOC status, we sometimes file some of our research findings into the UN system. In terms of themes, we look at freedom of religion and belief, the intersectionality between race and religion, as I said, largely around issues in the Thai South, in Myanmar. We look at the intersectionality between freedom of expression and technology. So we look at the outputs like disinformation, hate speech, digital surveillance, and we look at how to mitigate these things. We look at freedom of assembly and association from the perspective of civic space. We look at the laws that sort of impact the operations of civil society, which is a big issue for us in Southeast Asia. And last but not least, we look at elections. We look particularly at the backsliding of democracy in Southeast Asia and how elections, the unraveling of electoral system in the region put Southeast Asia on the back foot. We mainstream women, youth, minority communities, LGBT communities where we can. Some countries are a little bit more hostile than others when it comes to those issues, so we manage as we can. In terms of the work on Myanmar, We have done a range of cluster issues. One around Rohingya, we have organized seminars, conference, briefings, we track the issues. We are well versed with partners in Malaysia and Thailand, where many of the Rohingya refugees are based. We look at freedom of religion and belief, especially after the coup. We look at internet shutdowns, internet freedom issues, and last but not least, we look at shrinking civic space, not just now in Myanmar, but also along the borders. These are some of our publications around the issues. They are all free, available for download. We did a definitive report as the Junta shut down the internet in 2021 Feb. So you will get a very clear snapshot of what happened in that month. We look at religious laws in the region, and in this piece on Southeast Asia, we have a case study on Myanmar. We look at the heightened push on urbanization and Buddhism in Myanmar post-coup as it became a political icon, the way military organized it. We are also the Secretariat for Freedom and Religious Belief NGOs in Southeast Asia. And we did a need assessment about those issues in Southeast Asia, and Myanmar is featured very, very strongly. So, if you are talking about Myanmar, even when the first announcement came on ORF, if you're talking on Myanmar these days, you will, even before you start speaking, you will meet with headwinds. You will meet with several key narratives. The first narrative is, what do you know about Myanmar? So that's the first narrative you need to deal with. The second narrative is, if you're talking about elections, don't talk about elections because people are suffering. We have a civil war. Elections are not important. Then there's another group that won't say anything but continues to engage with Myanmar. China and India are big powers that do so. And then last but not least, is what I call the UN Walas, who would cite all kinds of UN resolution as to why we shouldn't engage or take a more strict stance. So you will have these four narratives that you have to navigate if you ever wanted to engage with Myanmar. I was informed by colleagues at ORF that we have a mixed of crowd. Some of you are fluent in the issues, some may be just here to just update yourself. So I'll do a mixed approach. I just wanted to, with this roadmap, share with you that since 2003, the Myanmar military has been pushed along through a roadmap of democracy. And what we are seeing now is really the unraveling of the roadmap. And if you want to understand Myanmar vis-a-vis, and if you have an interest in Southeast Asia, I think you need to keep in mind where Myanmar sits. This is just a visual. I'm going to unpack this slowly for you. But this is the thing, right? I think when you look at Myanmar, it's not just about whether the elections will be held, what the pundits are saying, but it's really to understand what does the Myanmar case tell us generally about elections, generally about democracy. The key issue here is many countries in the region either were forced or were willingly taken on the path of electoral reform at different stages. Now, whether it was Indonesia, whether it was Malaysia, whether it was Thailand, they were all taken along this path. But somewhere along this path, when the elites who also to some extent endorse the movement to reform, find themselves on the back foot. And this is what happened in Myanmar. Suddenly, their influence was dissipated as the NLD, became stronger electorally. As a result, there's an action to undermine the electoral process, to ensure the elites are back. Now, this is the same that is happening in Indonesia. In Indonesia, we no longer talk about coalition politics. We talk about cartel politics because everybody becomes the electoral mafia, right? They bring everybody together in order. So we don't talk about coalition, we talk about cartels. In Malaysia, it's also evolving from coalition to a cartel approach, you know. So you will see that all these processes, you know, tend to undermine the electoral system, and the net result is the backsliding of democracy. I wanted to kind of, you know, ask you to keep this, you know, framework at the back of the mind as we sort of get into this briefing. So if you're not a Myanmar watcher, you know, the key issue is the last elections that was held in November 2022. The junta raised the issue that the election was fraught with fraud. As a result, the country's stability was at risk. That the Myanmar junta needed to take the action, you know, to protect the country's stability as well as its sovereignty. And because of flaws in the electoral system that came out with the NLD result, they claimed the NLD rigged the elections, there were voter fraud, they had to reform and the electoral system. Now, the electoral system was already going on progressive reform. You know, electoral reform was ongoing, but they said it was not on the right track, so they needed to change it. So this is an overview of what has happened in the last 4 years. So we are at the cusp of the 4th year. So since the coup in February, in the first year, the state of emergency was for 1 year. But the junta at that 1 year promised to hold elections. However, it did not. It renewed the state of emergency elections for 6 times, each time for 6 months. The next renewal will be either end of the month or 1st of Feb. It's a question of dates, you know, so, but we are in the ballpark range. You know, if you read some reports, they will say it'll be this Saturday. If not, it'll be next week. So we will know from just in a week's time what the junta will say about the state of emergency and also where the window of elections. What is also, I think, important for us to be aware of is, unlike the previous, you know, nearly 4 years, this time the junta has actually marked 2025 as an election year, and it's taken, you know, some steps. So its argument was it was not safe to hold elections in the last 4 years. So we need to question, would it be safe to hold elections in 2025 or even in 2026? So the key justification is unrest. So when we talk about unrest, then we have to ask whether it's safe to hold elections and whether before you hold an election, you need to have a census. And I will also brief you about the state of the census. You know, the census was not complete, but they are still going ahead, at least in rhetorical terms, with the elections. Last but not least, you know, what I'll be sharing with you is what has been the interaction or reaction by the US, the UK, China, India, ASEAN, Malaysia, Thailand. These are key partners. I will also make a comment on my thoughts about where I think the NUG stands from the time 4 years ago and now. And so let's see. So in terms of the big picture, if you are mapping Myanmar, I've mentioned the state of emergency extensions 7 times, the first time for a year, and then 6 months for 6 times. The last one was renewed in August 2024, so the next one is coming soon. That that will also give you an indication whether it's for 6 months, 3 months, or 1 year. But I think we can anticipate 6 months, right? That will also give you a sense of when they are thinking about elections. The law around strengthening the junta has been increased. Firstly, that the three broad areas: one, they transfer the power to themselves, executive power. Two, they gave the military extrajudicial powers around military facilities and other activities around the capitals. And last but not least, they changed the law to reduce the rights and privileges of the citizens. So these are many, many laws. I'm just simplifying it for you in three clusters. Then there were laws introduced to curtail the organization and registration of CSOs. It's very, very fashionable. I don't know much about India, but it's very, very fashionable in Southeast Asia to label NGOs, grassroots movements as terrorists. Vietnam does it, and here we can see this language creep into not just to political parties such as NLD, but also to CSOs. So that I think is interesting. One of the things that upsets parents a lot is the conscription, because the number of soldiers that have deserted and have been killed in action, which the military simply calls missing in action, is substantial. You will see, in the title of the presentation, an Asia Center perspective. If you're wondering what is an Asia Center's perspective, it's simply a perspective of our researchers and our colleagues sitting in Southeast Asia and looking at Myanmar. So I will have tea in a place called Peninsula Plaza, where all the Burmese immigrants hang out in Singapore. And I'll have Burmese tea and Burmese onion pakora, and I can hear all kinds of conversation on Myanmar. We can interact to nearly 200,000 Rohingya refugees in Malaysia, Burmese workers from Chin State. I'm sure you have heard about Chiang Mai and all the displaced IDPs and NGOs in Chiang Mai, but you may not have heard about the fat cats in Bangkok, where the rich Burmese families move their children, bring their maids, buy apartments. If you go to the Thai immigration office, right, depending on which day, about 70% of the people applying for a student visa, spouse visa, guardian visa, business visa, retirement visa are Burmese. The Thai universities are flushed with an increase of Burmese students because desperate parents are selling flats and cars in Myanmar so they can keep their children to safety. So this is what you see, right? That's the Asia Center perspective. I'll keep going. So conscription is a very, very real and hurting concern for parents. And then you see just the exodus coming out. Last but not least, I'll just give you a flavor of the cybersecurity law. It's always the state's security, it's never the citizen security. And I think the key thing for you to keep in mind is the extrajudicial reach. So if you are saying anything nasty about the junta or the state, so the law is designed for them to sort of reach out to external placed Burmese or on their return to kick the law into motion. Many countries in Southeast Asia, Singapore included, also experiments with this kind of extrajudicial reach, but increasingly it's ignored or challenged. So I have the next three slides, and the flavor of the next three slides is about the dismantling of the electoral system that was chugging along slightly progressive in the last 10 years and last two elections. And I just wanted to give you a flavor of how they have annulled and unpacked it. So you get a sense if you were going to apply your lenses to other jurisdictions in Southeast Asia or even South Asia. So these are kind of the three main steps that you can take note of. So immediately after the coup, they established special courts under martial law. They arrested, election commission members that were appointed by the previous NLD government and appointed their own. They annul the election results. Even Thailand does it occasionally. They charged NLD leaders with electoral fraud. NLD and a range of other political parties were dissolved. If you want to, have a shortcut or cheat, you can go to Wikipedia and you can see the list. And you will see the parties that were dissolved were the ones with a higher number of votes and higher MPs and so on. And then, and of course, this would allow them to consolidate the 25% of military appointed personnel in parliament. Indonesia also has a similar formula. So you will see the behavior of countries that, evolve from a military-backed regime. They still try to keep on to residue power by giving privileged appointments to the military. So the first step is annulling the results and sitting MPs from the previous elections. Next, the discussion of proportional representation is not new. Generally, most jurisdictions is quite popular also globally to have more equitable representation and so on. So I think previously the NLD government had proposed it, but then it was dismissed by the Junta regime as saying that it's not constitutional. But this time the Junta is proposing it. And while, in intellectual, electoral principle, we may think proportional representation is good, but in these circumstances, there are a couple of key issues that you need to be aware of. One, that in the process of proposing a proportional representation, the 25% access to the military is still maintained. So I think that's the bottom line. And because it's maintained, what the proportional representation measure will do is actually dilute the democratic elements that will be returned through the electoral process. So what the junta would like to do is they want to keep a formula fixed base of 25%. But through the proportional representation, and this is a question of not taking any chances. I mean, they already got the kitty in the back because they've knocked off their main competitors. But in the outside chance that their USDP party doesn't get a significant result, they still can, grab seats and, presentation into parliament and ensure they have a substantial number of influence. So in that sense, PR under this formula is not truly proportional or representative, but it also dissipates the democratic elements within parliament. So I think that's the significance. Of course, you also need to factor in gerrymandering and all of that. I'll unpack that slightly for you in the next couple of slides when we talk about the census, and I'll give you a window of how, if elections were held, where they might be held and how they may look like. And next is the grip on political party registration. So after you dissolve political parties, you need to have a very, very tight system. Now, this is not just, I'm speaking about Southeast Asia, so this is not just unique for political parties. Such similar approaches, for example, are also taken, let's say, in Vietnam and Cambodia for civil society as well. As we say in Thailand, same, but different, right? So the key to look at is the political party registration law. Essentially, it puts the bar up very, very high in terms of the money you need to have in the bank, the number of party branches you need to have worldwide, and also the number of members you need to have. So the threshold is much, much higher, and it's not an enabling process. It's a disenabling process. And then I come back to this, regular habit in the region to simply, label, difficult entities as terrorist organizations. So another thing to look at is when the elites realize that their power has dissipated through the very electoral reforms that they may have grudgingly supported, they rejig the laws in a much, much tighter way. So I'm slowly aging us towards what's been happening in the last few months, and I'll end shortly with a bit of a foresight into how things may look like. Here is kind of a graphic example of the conflict, the various hotspots or red spots. So take about 15 seconds to just have a look at it, and then compare it, in a similar map 2 slides down. So before I bring you 2 slides down, I wanted to introduce a new document. It's not a legal document, it's the National Census. I don't know how much you are up to date, but I'll give you a flavor. This is a little bit more definitive on why we should take the so-called election timeline a little bit more seriously, because they have updated the census. Now, these are a few parameters. I'm going to go through point by point because I think this is new. It's interesting, and it is something not quite out in the market. All the other things that I have mentioned are in the market for the last 1 or 2 years. This is new. First, the National Unity Government, in just a recent article that came out, is seen to be in charge of at least 30% of the township. On the opposite side, the junta is only said to be in control of a touch over 30%. So I think that's, will already begin to tickle your mind about, which way we want to go and think about the elections. And in conducting the census, they were only able to reach half the townships. So here's the question: how are you going to, conduct an election, give the ballots, arrange your polling stations, and so on? Because elections is a logistical exercise. And as I say this, please keep in mind all the entities, governments, INGOs, CSOs, who are in the election training business, and how they are reacting and responding to all these developments. So to dive in, the census were conducted just 2 weeks in early October, so not many months ago, with 15 million. Please cross-check. I didn't put the figure down. 15 million USD given by China. Right, so you start connecting the dots. 51.3 million were counted, lower than 10 years ago. In most cases, the population would have surpassed, right? Indicative figures are it should have been at least 55 million. So you can imagine the exodus out of the country, including, we're not sure how many are killed. The numbers generally are much smaller. stated outside, but you have no way of verifying it. But you see, it's actually less. So I think those are things to take note of. And then the next bullet point, they were only able to count 32 million. And I'll give you an insight further of how this actually looks. 19 million is a guesstimate. So we are going into an election on a guesstimate number. We also do not know how tightly the 32 million were counted. Age group, gender, all of these issues. So now we are going into the nitty-gritty. From the big picture about getting rid of the elected parties, bringing new laws from all dimensions, and then we are going to nitty-gritty of the logistics of election management and rolling out because elections are about this, right? And then of course also take note of the gender divide. Also, the numbers return less men, more women. It also shows the challenges among gender, how much of the female populations are also kind of trapped in a country of conflict, while the men, may have an easier time to flee, for example. This has to be verified and proved, but I just wanted to again give you the numbers so you have it in front of you. So just to flick back, so from here, the conflict, let's jump to here. So the very darkest part is where the full clash, the resistance, the fighting is taking place. I'll show a next slide that gives you more visibility. This is a little bit convoluted. And then the clearer ones or the white ones are where the junta has full control. So again, please reflect on the census, please reflect on the state of resistance and fighting, and think through about where elections may reasonably held. And also think about all those entities, whether it's governments, NGOs, or CSOs, who want to support the election business. What can they really do? And what should we think about the efforts that they do? I don't know whether you can see this clearly, but I will say a couple of things, then you can figure that out. Please look at Yangon. So Yangon is like fourth from the bottom, 7 million. Okay, this is a controlled area, right? Definitely an area the junta would want to hold an election, right? And then they counted it tight. So if you look at the right side, and you look at the estimated population for unenumerated areas, it's a dash because they were able to be in charge and count properly. So let's pick another state. Let's pick Rakhine, right? They could only count 345,000. But the guesstimate is 2.1 million. Right? Now the Arakan army is in charge. So from here, if you are able to, I'll give you one more example. So when you access this report, you can Google it. You know how to read it, right? So that's the exercise here. Let's look at Mandalay. Mandalay, 4.65 million. And then you look at the right side. Even in a place like Mandalay, they still have to do some guesstimation, nearly 2 million. So, and then I'll go to some of the conflict areas. Let's look at number 2, Kachin. They were only able to count 775,000 people, and then couldn't count nearly 1.4 million. So that's what we are dealing with. So if you look at it very, very specifically, you can make out where are the conflict places. The places where they could only estimate the population are the places where they don't have access. If you look at Chin State, although small as it is, they don't really get access. So we will know places where they are likely to hold elections. Yangon, look at the last two, Ayeyarwady, Naypyidaw. These are places they have tight grip. So if you had heard, Myanmar pundits say, "Oh, it's going to be a staggered elections," then you already know which part of Myanmar they are likely to hold elections, right? So this is the forensic of the census report. So I think this is the new variable. I think if you study and have a bit of forensic of that report, you may have a better ability to project possible scenarios into where Myanmar elections may be going. So I leave it there. It's a public document, so please, come up with your own analysis. So slowly moving to the end, anyone who is watching Myanmar by now, having read the latest reports, this document include what they will be articulating is kind of a view that it'll be a staggered elections, right? So that's on the lip. But what we have seen is with the conflict, their ability to control those areas, with their ability not to count the numbers, it is quite clear they cannot hold a one-time nationwide election. Okay, that's I think one variable that you can kind of try to think through. Given the grip over some of the key cities, Ayeyarwady, Naypyidaw, Yangon, these are likely areas where elections may be called and where they can push for victory. Also using all the laws and regulation, registration, proportional, all counting in their favor in addition, right? They're not leaving anything to chance. So there is talk that they will, start. So I'm going to the point 3 and point 4, which more or less kind of say the same thing. They're going to do staggered elections. They will do it in places they think they are safe, and then move on to other areas. Now, we don't know what is the time frame from one area to another, because we don't know, because the conflict is ongoing. There'll be so many variables, dynamics, and so on. So you can't say, okay, we will have, hold in Yangon, Ayeyarwady, and Naypyidaw first, and 3 months later we'll hold somewhere else. So it's going to be difficult. It is quite clear that in the ethnic areas around the Burma nation is challenging. Apart from the fighting, you can also see another layer of evidence that they can't get to count the numbers there. And because of the way the law has been structured, it will give an unnatural advantage to the junta and the junta-aligned political parties. So if we go back to the motherhood statement earlier on backsliding, democratic backsliding, you can see, within the three over years, how they have unraveled an electoral system that was, slightly but slowly marching on the progressive path, and then really reversed it in so many ways. As I mentioned, the headwinds. Myanmar people have been suffering, and that is, saying the least. So from their feeling, right, they are not for elections. They see the elections as illegitimate. even when you know want to speak about the elections, you know, intellectually or analytically, like a briefing like this, they will also be concerned that just along the way, by the way, a speaker or two might, you know, incorrectly endorse the election and give it legitimacy. So people generally, Myanmar people are generally afraid. And they would like a federal system given the ethnic plurality. And you can also see from the census, the conflict map, and all that, maybe that almost makes common sense, right? So this is, you know, I'm summarizing it in the interest of time very briefly. So that's a broad sense of, you know, feelings from the Myanmar people, and they look towards the international community for support in facilitating. So what I'm trying to say here is, then what about countries that may not be responsive to the feelings of the Myanmar people, right? So next, I think we you know, if you follow the issues the last 4 years, you can develop a nuance between the US and the EU. EU is pretty straightforward. No, it's crap, you know. They're illegitimate, let's not support that. Not only do the EU say that, but the EU-supported INGOs also have a very similar and strong position. They don't engage, they pull out all the INGOs and INGOs from the country. The US has been a little bit kind of, you know, standing behind ASEAN. Time to time, you know, particular, you know, leaders from the administration may say a few things, but they often, you know, stand behind the rhetoric of the international community and increasingly behind, you know, supporting ASEAN position on Myanmar, which is, you know, coming up next. But before that, China. So the Chinese approach is to look for a formula to reduce tension. Their viewpoint is elections may be a variable, a tool to reduce tension. So that's their thinking. They have, you know, several very nuanced thinking, but if you want to understand the Chinese heartbeat, they are about, you know, the motivation is about finding a solution, and in their thought process, having an election may reduce tension. So hence the money to conduct the census and, you know, expressing this, you know, language of transition in Myanmar. We may have our own views about, you know, what we think about it, but I just wanted to just put a general view out for you. India's approach, not publicly announced, so you will need to do your own intel, just like intel gathering is concerned. So you will need to understand who went to Naypyidaw, who did election training on behalf of the Indian Election Commission, because India and the Indian, after all, it's National Voters Day, right? Yeah, on Saturday, yeah. So there's a big conference organized by the election. So India takes pride of being able to run very good elections. So it wants to share that experience and knowledge to other countries around the world, in the region. Myanmar is not an exception. So it wants to support through EMVs, training, but you won't see a smoking gun, right? So unless you do your own intel gathering, unless you have a network of people, you know who's going, when's the date, when the training, you won't really be able to map the Indian experience. You will need to have conversations with the mainstream Indian think tanks to know the kind of delegations they bring into India from all parties, whether they come directly to Delhi for meet and greet and discussion, or whether they are brought over the border to also, you know, introduce connectivity. You know, I mean, it's such a long border, right, India. So that's kind of, so these two countries want to engage. So we need to think about if the Burmese people's view is this way and this country is engaged to facilitate elections, and we already kind of know how the election framework, the staggered approach might be, I'm not sure whether it's good branding for these two countries or not in the eyes of the Burmese people or other entities may have a different worldview. So that's something I want to put out there for your consideration and discussion. Then we'll have to look at ASEAN. Not very effective, but I think what is interesting if you want to talk about ASEAN is to look at Thailand, and then for this year look at Malaysia. So the big picture statement from ASEAN is don't prioritize elections, prioritize the end of the conflict. That's the motherhood statement. But it's what happens in Thailand, I think that is interesting. Thailand's military has a very strong relationship with the Burmese military. They are known as brothers, they talk to each other. And, now Thaksin is back. And he's also kind of working behind the scene. Anwar Ibrahim has made him advisor to Malaysia's chair as ASEAN, which also means tapping his kind of viewpoint on Myanmar. Malaysia will be active if it's not the government, because the government may be a little bit more strategic. But the NGOs, the Malaysian NGOs, will be active. They always have been in support of the Rohingyas. So I think this will give them a bit of elbow room and muscle this year to become more active on Myanmar issues. I'm expecting, already here on the grapevine, activities, delegations, and things like that from the third sector. Because we are in that space, we get intel around those kinds of things. Conclusion, again, this is, not my perspective. It's a perspective, from the research team of the Asia Center. We have also been working on elections. We have a special issue with the Kyoto University's Center for Southeast Asian Studies on eroding legitimacy of elections in Southeast Asia. We have a report on Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Cambodia. From that, at this stage where we stand, there seems to be overwhelming support from China and India to support the elections in Myanmar. China has been a bit more publicly vocal. India does it, quietly behind the scene, mostly through training and support and bringing delegations over. There is no clear and effective direction from ASEAN. It's always unclear, inactive motherhood statements, but my suggestion is to look under ASEAN and keep an eye on Thailand, and to some extent for this year on Malaysia. EU is a little bit too far. It's kind of hard statements, but they do not translate into effective actions apart from a shared approach with NGOs and mission not to engage in the country. So a lot of the NGOs have come out. We need to look at how Trump would act. So far, he's been calling Putin names today, so we'll have to see how is that. But the previous administration, both Biden and some of the key officers, their approach was indirect, either to support the UN, resolutions or ASEAN's position on it. They have not been so direct, in our view, as the EU. It really depends on who you talk to, and whoever you talk to, and depending on how close or how far they are with NUG and NUG representative. But for us, I think their political role has gradually reduced in terms of influence, both internally, regionally, and internationally, regionally, and domestically. And there's nothing we can do about that. It is what it is. I think the initial fervor, expectation, and strength of the NUG has kind of slightly lost its luster. In the early days, everybody was dropping their, oh, I met this minister from NUG, they are in Mizoram, they are in Delhi or somewhere else. Was very active, very strong. People were expecting the NUG's role to perhaps grow and become more influential, but it's kind of just, kind of tapered down. So I think just to recognize that. What we see moving forward is a very prolonged and unsatisfactory situation in Myanmar. Either way, everybody loses. Even if, I think, even if it's a staggered elections, it would be a forced elections. Without China's and India's, geopolitical interests leaning on Myanmar to have the elections one way or another. We know that it's going to be challenging to have a one-stop, immediate, nationwide election. It's going to be fragmented, it's going to be sectional, and it'll be probably unsatisfactory. So if the pie is so complex and complicated, if you put your hand in it, I think you have a big risk of reputation damage. This is what I see if China and India support the election. They can do so nevertheless. The officers in charge will advise them appropriately what is important for its foreign policy interests. But there's that kind of, reputation damage also to be managed if it goes that way. So those are, some briefing points on a very, very complicated and constantly evolving situation in Myanmar. Very happy to be here. Thanks, ORF. It's my first talk, at ORF. It's only recently, as I mentioned, the Asia Center has been tapped by several Indian think tanks to speak at the activities in the region and also the last few trips here in Delhi. So very, very happy for my inaugural talk here. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks, James. Thanks. It was a very enlightening talk, and I'll open the floor to a Q&A. But let me use my privilege to ask you the first question. So, you said that the junta had taken over, and the excuse they made was that everything was going out of sync in the country, and they needed to protect the country, put it back together. But very clearly, the opposite has happened. And I don't think anybody really expected when the coup took place that things will spiral out of control the way they have. So now the question is that if they are planning to hold elections, what is the purpose? Is the purpose that you paper over the military takeover, and then anybody who wants to deal with Myanmar gets this thing that okay, fine, these guys have held election, a transition is taking place, and so basically to legitimize your interaction with that regime. One. Second, it could be that the junta realizes that things have actually gone out of control. They can't put Humpty Dumpty back together. So the elections are a kind of the beginning of a exit route from the grab of power. Which of the two? Number one. Number two, on the issue of legitimacy. So look, if when a military takeover takes place, we have countries like Pakistan, my favorite country, The military takes over either directly or indirectly. Right now, it's indirectly, they've taken over. Uh, but, by and large, the people accept the military's rule. So then an election helps to give legitimacy to whatever puppet regime they have. I don't see how that's going to happen in Myanmar, because even if you hold an election, I don't see how the people are going to give that, whatever election outcome happens, how that is going to be legitimate in the eyes of the people. And I don't see how that's going to stop the fighting. Or am I reading the situation wrong?
Okay, thank you. For the first part, whether it's an exit route um, uh, or seeking legitimacy, I I made a trip not too long ago last year to Yangon, and if you go to Yangon, you'll be pleasantly surprised. The streets are extremely clean. The road is being repaired, tarred, sidewalks, are painted, repaired. It's very, very pleasant. I was sitting in a tea shop talking to an informant, a former journalist, and then I was approached by a Singaporean who recognized me at the tea shop. And I asked him, he asked me what I was doing here. I said, look, I'm here for research. What are you doing here? Oh, I'm a Haagen-Dazs distributor. So I said, wow, okay. So what are you doing in Yangon? Oh, I'm looking for how to distribute Haagen-Dazs cards in the shopping malls in Yangon. So I said, how is that going for you? And he said, well, I have two problems. One, how do I bring my ice cream to Yangon? Because it's complicated to open a factory to produce the ice cream there. So I have to bring it from Thailand. So he said the whole shipping and movement of goods to Thailand is complicated. But the more important thing was that worries him was how is he going to bring his money back? But for me, what was interesting is I asked him, I mean, there's a conflict and all that, and he's a businessman, and he's just dismissed it and saying, no, our intel is Myanmar is getting ready for business. So we are also getting ready. And this was just several months back. So the way I see it is, I don't think Myanmar junta will have an exit route. I think what they may have is an attempt to try to legitimize their rule through elections and hoping that it will organically, permeate and that they will be able to hold elections across the country and so on. My sense, it is going to be complicated because I think Myanmar is a very, very divided society. I've been to Myanmar over many years. In the period, in the run-up to where NLD got a little bit more space starting 2015, most people were fed up with the military because they were not having a share of the pie. So part of the reform of the military was to extend the share of the pie to other elite families and children, right? And people were willing to accept the junta's rule as long as they got a share of the spoils. What I see is the junta can perhaps tame and control in certain key areas that it has a good grip, like some of the states that I showed through the census. And there will be areas where it will have a contested grip. So we could also, at this stage, consider thinking about a fragmented Myanmar. Fragmented along the sides. Now, whether it's federalism or straight break, I mean, many of these areas can be quite, viable. I mean, if Timor-Leste can move from a 800,000 little tiny space to about 1.4 million now, Singapore is only, the citizens are only 3.3 million. Everybody else is either a resident or a foreign worker. We have close to 6 million people. In some of these states, you have excess of 3, 4, 5 million. I'm talking about some of the content. Some are much smaller, of course. So that's also, viable, and they have some natural resources far more than Timor-Leste had when it first started out. So for my thought process, kind of goes that way as well.
So basically, what you're saying is that we could very well see fragmentation of the Myanmar state as we know it, at least maybe not formal fragmentation, but informally, there'll be the core area where the junta rules, and there will be the periphery where there are these various groups which call the shots. So yeah, it's a bit of a mishmash.
Yes,
If I
and
get it.
we have
But how does that bring peace and stability, or is it like uh, there is there is peace and stability in individual regions, but overall there is none?
yeah. I mean, it's peace for whom, right?
Yeah,
So I mean, parents want their children to be safe. They don't want their children to be conscripted by the junta.
yeah.
Yeah,
So let the poor people's kids fight the war, and the rich kids party in Bangkok,
yeah.
right?
Or Singapore.
Professor, my name is Soumya. I'm a fellow with ORF. When you talk about the fragmented state of Myanmar post elections, what could be the spillover effect of it for India and especially the border regions? Do you see any kind of security impact on, let's say, keeping in mind the Rohingya population, which is taking refuge in our country in the border areas? And also, when you see involvement of China in Myanmar, do you see the two of them coming together doing something nasty with Indian security? So, something on that. Thank you.
Can I take two, three questions and
Oh
then
yeah,
you
yeah,
can?
yeah.
India's response since coup to the entire Myanmar situation is all over the place. On the one hand, they have supported they talk about democracy. On the other hand, Election Commission is actively engaging with junta to sell EVMs. On the one hand, you have a huge number of refugees being allowed. On the other hand, the free movement regime has been stopped. They talk about federalism, they invite junta people and not NUG people for this. So it's sort of a response which is either not here nor there. So how do you see the Indian response, and what do you think is the future of India's approach towards Myanmar in general?
Rajiv, you had a question?
Good evening, Professor. I'm Rajiv Sinha. I'm a distinguished fellow here at the ORF. I had just two questions. Firstly, thank you for your presentation. It's interesting and indeed informative.
Rajiv, can you speak in the mic?
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to ask you was, going from your presentation, I get the impression that the electoral reform process is not going to go anywhere, given the fact that the junta seems totally uninterested. So that's one. And then you spoke about staggered elections. Now, what is the legitimacy of a staggered election? I can have election in Naypyidaw and Yangon today and have election in Kachin State after 4 months. How does that make it fair, and will it be acceptable in the international community? That's the other part. And then the other thing is that, in Myanmar or Burma for that matter, we've seen the junta being behind the political process from the very beginning. So I don't, as Sushant said, the junta will always be there, and it can always step in to take political control when it feels its interests or its key strategic interests are in danger. That's the other thing I want to ask. And the third thing I want to ask you was, you spoke about conscription, and you also talked about targeting the Rohingyas. What did you mean by that? I was not very clear. Your presentation, your slide
Okay.
talked about conscription, And then you said targeting the Rohingyas. Now, are you talking in terms of recruiting them or targeting them physically? I wasn't very sure. Thought that's what
Right.
exactly you meant by that.
Let's take these three.
Yeah. I'll just respond to that. Maybe that's the role of the tongue. It's a cultural thing. I spilled 2 points in one row. But essentially, I was talking about conscription across the board. Yeah, not about the Rohingya. I think the Rohingya issue is entirely a different one. I think it's caught up with the whole Arakan, Bangladesh, and what would happen to them now given the Arakan army. So I would like to park that aside, but just to clarify, what I meant was conscription. I'll start with you, sir. Your question. So it's not reform. It is the dismantling of electoral reform by tightening. And the mechanism is actually to return and ensure the elite remains in power. Because across Southeast Asia, and it's the same in Thailand, it's the same in Indonesia, it's the same in Cambodia. The elites are a small group of rich oligarchy, right? And they have business and financial interests. Their mates are in different levels of bureaucracy. So by extension, that's how they control the state, and the state is used to extract resources into family pockets and then to sustain them intergenerationally, right? Now we see that in Thailand, we see that in from Hun Sen to Hun Mane in Cambodia, and also Indonesia. Jokowi's sons are, in a few places. At this stage, based on the evidence that we have, both in terms of security and the census, the logic is pointing towards staggered elections. Now, the country, most people don't want the elections, apart from the junta and the two big powers that seem to somehow want to find a way to reduce the tensions in the country because it affects their own security along the borders. So that's their motivation. So as long as the two big regional powers, China and India, are motivated by their concerns of security on the border and then see facilitating a staggered, which in the eyes of many, including the Burmese people, an illegitimate election, that's where we're going to have the problem. So we are trading security for legitimacy. So that's a different calculation and so on. And I think on the question of the border security, I think India's rhetoric is a lot on security. Your border is like, wow, so long. But also, I think your border crossings are not as sharp and finesse like the Chinese ones. Still rough, many years behind. So, and it also depends on the community on the other side. The state is very security minded, but the communities may have a kind of a human approach to their brethren and sisters across the border. So I think there's that too, the hard dimension of the state-led security, and then I think the human dimension. I think we must talk about the family cross-border ties and that kind of emotion that drives why they want to help someone from the other side. So I think that element. And then I'll come to about the NUG, India's approach. I consider, for myself, my colleagues from Asia Center to be very privileged to be sought out by some of the Indian think tanks to speak at their events, and we are very grateful. We are learning a lot. We welcome, as an Indian diaspora myself, I enjoy my desi gear and gunpowder on my morning dosas, something you don't easily get in Bangkok. But I also want to be very frank. I found some of your mainstream think tanks to be broadly conservative. I don't know. Maybe you take money from the state. Maybe that's how your DNA is. Maybe you have many military or security people on your board, your benefactors. So you're kind of always a little bit shy, a little bit reserved. You have a certain, kind of framework within which you operate. You want to be safe. If you talk to someone who works on Myanmar, they have access to this state colleague, that intelligence service, this, that, and the other. I'm not sure whether they have engagement with the community, right? And to get so we have access to community. So that's so I get this kind of reading about your parameters of how you think about an issue. I think you have a certain culture and history about your think tanks and the parameters and how you operate. I think it has a very, very statist feature, So I think that's why your approach is that way. I also found it very, very paper-based. I was very surprised in the several interactions I had. It was very clear to me that they want to, tap us, engage us, especially on our expertise on Southeast Asia. That's absolutely clear, whether it's in Southeast Asia or in India. But our conversations always sort of hover around writing paper for their journal or writing a chapter for the book. But at Asia Center, that's not where we are at, right? We are not involved in talk shops. I mean, we do evidence-based research. We translate that to capacity building for communities. We advocate, we speak up, We are based in Thailand, a little bit free, and all of that. So I do feel in the few engagements I've had, and some of them have become fast friends in the think tank space, but there's that, we are like that here, and all of that. So I think you have a culture of how and I think that may influence why you, as I heard from that colleague, why NUG is not so maybe mainstream in some of the conversation.
Another thing that I was keen to know from you is what's you have not referred to the role Russia is attempt to play in that region.
Good.
I thought if you could say something about that, that'll be interesting to hear from you.
I'm working on electoral system, sir, and you mentioned about proportional representation. It intrigued me. So, sir, do you think that the electoral system, the choice of the electoral system, has also got the role in fragmenting the Burmese society? A lot has to do with the electoral system in the choice that has been made, proportional representation. And do you think a better alternative, like the first past the post or mixed member proportional representation system, would yield a different kind of results? Because in Lebanon, this proportional representation system has also led to the same kind of problem that you have been articulating about Myanmar, sir.
Dr. James, that was very interesting to know, particularly about the elections. I have a little bit of a technical question regarding Kaya. You mentioned that the unenumerated areas is not very high, which means that they have a good sense of the numbers there. But what we have understood is that Kaya is one state where 80% of the territory is no more with the, military. So in that case, how do they, will there actually be elections in Karenni state, especially after Operation, 1111? So that is one question. And the second is to do with the NUG Minister of Defense. You said he's in full control of 95 out of 330 townships. And then you said that NUG, the power of NUG and their control overall is diminishing. But on the other hand, we see that more than 50% of the country's territory doesn't really belong to the military anymore, especially if you look at Rakhine today. There has been op-eds written about a battle of Sitwe coming in the next couple of months. So in such a case, where do you look at elections, especially from a EAO's point of view?
Thanks, James, for the very enlightening talk. I just have two questions. One, just relating to what she said about NUG and weakening this thing. Like the previous years, actually, it looks like the protest and NUG's sort of is very subdued. And incidentally, I met a couple of their ministers in Prague recently. They were also saying something similar. But the real thing that they said is about the territory they control. Like in last 3 years, the junta has lost a lot of territories, and both Arakan army and other those rebel, the ethnic armies are actually taken over a lot of territories. So in a sense, if the junta holds the elections, as you said, it will be staggered, but can they really hold election in those territories? Almost like more than 50% territories are in control of those rebels and all that. So can they hold the election? Because you don't have a figure like Aung San Suu Kyi or NLD or Than Se, who actually facilitate the democratization process in 2013. Those sort of climate is not there. So how do you bring those sort of groups actually to agree to an election? That's the biggest challenge. And then international environment is also very bleak. I mean, you don't have a Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton making a visit to Myanmar or facilitating a lot of things that were happening in 2012 or 13. So that scenario has completely changed with Trump or even European Union, which is struggling itself. So I'm saying, how do you actually really see election happening in such a climate and then its credibility?
But Niranjan, I think very easy answer to your question. You can call the Pakistan army and they can hold the election. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. My question is that according to reports, in fact, the regime over there is promoting, this is basically putting restrictions on internet, and there has been, internet can only be accessed through satellite and low orbit satellites, like Starlink. So how do you see that, going forward? Because under such circumstances, information and elections can't be held freely, and they are also promoting cyber crimes and money laundering through these, so which is also giving bad reputation to the economy of the Myanmar. And my second question is that US has, raised sanctions against Myanmar, but they are getting, at the same time, some of the weapons, from China and some of the other places like Russia also. So do you see that, these sanctions are working, or they are having any kind of impact, as far as bringing democracy is concerned? Thanks.
Thank you for considering my question. I'm Shresh Sharma, research intern at the Center of Geoeconomics for the Global South. My question is with respect to the mention of ASEAN. As you said that we have seen in the past that throughout this situation with the Tatmadaw, they have failed to bring Myanmar to a situation where they could come in a peaceful state. And now when it is zeroed down to the point of election, even then ASEAN looks a little, inefficient. With respect to how it's working. So what is the relevance of ASEAN now? How do you see its relevance in the broader Southeast Asian region, because it has failed in this one circumstance already?
Thank you, James, for a very interesting presentation. You mentioned backslide in democracy in countries like Malaysia. Indonesia was always guided democracy. But you also mentioned, when you were talking about India's perspective and China's perspective, that there is interest in fair elections of some kind. Is China really keen on fair elections? Because in all previous democratic rules in Myanmar, China has faced a lot of protests against infrastructure building, including the Ministrom Dam, etc. The only place it succeeded very well was Chakfu port. Now China is thriving with various projects, including the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, the Maritime Silk Route. So are they really keen to see fair elections, or are they going to have a tie-up with the military junta?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that enriching presentation. Slightly drawing from what Sushant sir also asked. is the new normal going to be the rich guys going to Bangkok and Singapore partying around and the poor people fighting? Because you mentioned about fragmentation, there's a divide. There is the people are thinking that elections are illegitimate. So is the new unsustainability become the sustainable future of Myanmar? Is what you contemplate or you fear?
Thank you, James, for a very awesome presentation. Somehow, Chinese role is not becoming clear in Myanmar. See, Chinese are supporting all the Shans and Thangs, all the EOs with weapons, money, and everything. They're also supporting the junta. They want peace. They also are profiting from the war. So, what exactly are they looking at in China?
Thank you so much for your presentation. My question, I think, is to both of you, also to you, Sushant, for a reflection. My name is Josephine van Zanten. I work for the Dutch Embassy here in Delhi. I am wondering more about the role of India, possible role of India in the elections and the calculation that India is making, given that most of its stakes at the moment are in the Kaladan projects in Rakhine and the security along the border. In what sense does it make sense for India at this point to support elections?
Okay, so I think that's all the questions and they're all directed at me. One is at me. I am completely ignorant, so I will let James answer for me.
Thank you for the rich range of question. I will try to kind of, try to tackle it in one broad statement, and I'll hang around for tea, so come and engage. I think both for China and India, they see elections as a tool in their minds to resolve this current problem, this impasse. That's their thinking, right? So it's not about whether it's free or fair, but in their mind, based on the intel, the advice they would have got from the think tanks, the state security, especially around the border, the investments, in the case of India. For China, I think the approach is, I'm from Singapore. We are a gambling culture. We bet on all sides and hope for the best, right? So that's how to understand it. So you bet on all sides, and then you can go to the winning side and do a deal. It's always the case. In Thailand, politics is also the scam. So I think that's where these two big powers are at. They have their own national interests, and they are seeing in their mind, based on the advice their decision makers would have gotten, that they see supporting an election. What I'm suggesting is, when they do that, there is a consequence. And the consequence is based on the fact that at this current security state, the elections inevitably will be fragmented if it even goes to that situation. And if it does, there will be cries of legitimacy, including, what is the value for the EOs from that point of view if elections are not coming their way anyway. So in that regard, I think, the gentleman who's a PhD student, I want to, address your question. I think proportional representation was always there. Whether it's a direct PR system or a mixed system, I think what missing in the Myanmar process is the process, right? The stakeholding, right? Without the stakeholders coming together, putting together a new constitution and being part of the process, any system that you put in place for election will not have the buy-in. Last but not least, I'll end by saying the Myanmar rich have always been in Bangkok and Singapore. I call them the fat cats. They've always been there. They've always parked the money in Singapore. I think Singapore has always been pro-Myanmar, done a lot of investment, built hotels, supplied military arms, supplied the early electronic intelligence equipment, and so on and so forth. Now it's done an about turn, right? Because it's not good for PR. Singapore, because of its engagement for many, many years, has a good brand name. If you walk into Myanmar, if you take a cab, talk to anyone, and you say you are from Singapore, it's a tick, right? So it has that good brand name because it had invested for so long. And Singapore, government servants from the GLCs, once they retire, when they have a pot full of money, they go and invest and do business and things like that. So I think the Myanmar rich, their playing ground would be mostly Bangkok and Singapore in the early days. If you know Thailand well, Black Canyon was the restaurant in Yangon to go to because all the kids from the military families would be there. But a final remark is really, on Russia. I think Russia is re-engaging. There are some news reports, but we don't see so much its role and its desire to actively engage in the electoral process. So that's why I didn't mention it. And finally, ASEAN, I think, with the strong influence of China, ASEAN is very much broken up. Cambodia, Laos are very much vassal states. Thailand will neither go left or right. So I think for me, the ASEAN project is more or less over, or it's just still born, it's just rhetoric. So as a result, I don't think they can do much. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, James. It was truly a very enlightening presentation, and let me invite you all for tea in the next room.
Thank you.